Jennifer Mitchell sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, watching her daughter Sarah methodically color a princess in a coloring book. The 3-year-old's tongue poked slightly out of her mouth in concentration, her small hand moving in careful, deliberate strokes. To anyone passing by, it would have seemed like a perfectly normal afternoon, a mother observing her child engaged in a simple, innocent activity. But Jennifer's stomach churned with an anxiety that had become her constant companion, a gnawing sense that something was profoundly wrong. 6 months ago, just 6 months, Sarah had been a different child entirely. She was a tiny songbird, her voice filling their home with constant chatter and off-key melodies. Jennifer could still hear her singing in her memory. "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star," mangled and beautiful, sung while Sarah splashed in the bathtub. She remembered Sarah belting out songs in the grocery store, completely unself-conscious, delighting strangers with her infectious enthusiasm. Jennifer had occasionally felt mild embarrassment at Sarah's volume and lack of filter, but mostly she'd felt joy. Her daughter was happy, expressive, and uninhibited, everything a 3-year-old should be. Now 4 months of near-total silence had passed. It wasn't a gradual fading of words. It was an abrupt cessation, as if someone had flipped a switch. Sarah still made sounds, grunts, whimpers, occasional frustrated cries, but actual words had vanished almost entirely. She communicated now through elaborate systems of head shakes and nods, through pointing and gesturing. When she absolutely needed something, she would produce single words in a flat, emotionless tone that broke Jennifer's heart. Water, bathroom, tired. Jennifer had become obsessed with tracking the timeline, replaying events like a detective searching for the exact moment everything changed. It had happened sometime in late spring, she was certain. Before that, Sarah had been cheerful, talkative, her personality shining through every interaction. Then came a gradual shift, first a reluctance to speak at school, then at home. Within weeks, the silence was nearly complete. Jennifer had frantically searched her memory for any event that might have triggered such a dramatic change. A fall, a frightening experience, a fever-induced hallucination. Nothing stood out. The change seemed to have no logical origin, which terrified her even more. The pediatrician visits had begun almost immediately. Dr. Richardson, their family doctor for 5 years, listened politely as Jennifer described Sarah's sudden mutism. He examined her throat, checked her ears, asked standard developmental questions. "Sometimes children go through phases," he'd said reassuringly. "Speech can regress temporarily during stress or when they're processing something. Has anything changed in her life? A new sibling, parent separation, moving to a new home?" "Nothing," Jennifer had answered, her voice small. "Everything's the same. She's with me mostly. And her regular babysitter misses sometimes when I work. Her father takes her 1 weekend a month, but she's always been fine with that." Dr. Richardson had nodded thoughtfully. "Children are resilient. I'd give it another month or 2. If she's not speaking by then, we can consider a speech evaluation." But Jennifer didn't have another month or 2. She was living in a state of constant, low-grade terror. She'd taken her daughter to 5 different pediatricians over the next 8 weeks, each visit a desperate plea for answers. One doctor suggested selective mutism, a psychological condition where children could speak, but chose not to in certain situations. Another mentioned autism spectrum disorders and recommended early intervention services. A third, barely hiding his irritation at what he clearly viewed as an anxious mother, suggested speech was just slower for some children, and recommended she stop worrying so much. Yet Jennifer knew her daughter. She knew her more intimately than anyone else on earth, had spent every day since Sarah's birth learning her rhythms, her personality, her particular way of being in the world. And this silence was wrong. This wasn't a developmental phase or a normal variance in the spectrum of childhood development. This was her daughter withdrawing, shrinking, disappearing into herself. The light that had always animated Sarah's face seemed dimmer now. Her eyes, once bright with curiosity and mischief, seemed distant and fearful. What terrified Jennifer most wasn't just the silence itself, but the other changes that accompanied it. Sarah had developed habits that seemed both compulsive and protective. During baths, she'd become almost frantic when Jennifer tried to wash her body, screaming if Jennifer touched certain areas, thrashing and trying to cover herself with her hands. A bath that once lasted 20 minutes of joyful splashing now lasted 5 minutes of struggle and tears. Sarah would cry at random moments, sitting on the floor, suddenly overcome with sobs but unable or unwilling to explain why. Then there was the incident with Uncle David. Jennifer had watched it happen one Sunday afternoon when David came over for dinner. Sarah had been playing quietly in the corner with her toys, seemingly content. David had come over to interact with her, reaching out to affectionately touch her shoulder. It was the kind of casual, loving gesture he'd made hundreds of times before. But this time, Sarah's reaction had been visceral and terrifying. She'd screamed, a sound of pure terror, and scrambled backward, knocking into the furniture. Her face had gone pale, her eyes wide with what could only be described as primal fear. "Sarah, honey, it's Uncle David," Jennifer had said, rushing over, but Sarah was inconsolable. She'd buried her face in Jennifer's chest, her entire body trembling. David had looked shocked and hurt. "Did I scare her?" he'd asked. "I was just trying to say hi." Jennifer had apologized, attributing it to Sarah being tired or overstimulated, but her mind was racing. Sarah's fear hadn't seemed like normal child wariness. It had seemed like the response to a genuine threat. Since that day, Sarah flinched whenever David approached, and there were other disturbing behaviors too. Behaviors that Jennifer couldn't quite articulate but that set off alarm bells in her maternal instincts. Sarah displayed an inappropriate interest in the area between her legs, touching herself frequently, and with an intensity that seemed beyond normal childhood curiosity. She'd ask strange questions, questions that seemed far too advanced, far too adult for a 3-year-old. Once, completely out of context, she'd asked, "Does it hurt when the man does the thing?" Jennifer had felt the blood drain from her face. Where had that come from? What man? What thing? When Jennifer pressed gently, trying to understand, Sarah would shut down completely, retreating further into silence, tears streaming down her face but no words coming. The nights were worst. Sarah had begun having nightmares. She'd wake up screaming, her small body drenched in sweat, thrashing against invisible threats. When Jennifer held her and asked what was wrong, Sarah couldn't or wouldn't say. She'd just cling to Jennifer desperately, her entire body rigid with fear, trembling for hours before finally exhausting herself back to sleep. Jennifer had tried to discuss these concerns with the pediatrician, but the responses were frustratingly vague. Children go through difficult phases. Every child develops at their own pace. If you're really concerned, we could refer you to a child psychologist. As if Jennifer's very real, very urgent concerns were just the paranoia of an anxious mother. But Jennifer knew, with a certainty that lived in her bones, that something catastrophic had happened to her daughter. Some trauma, some violation, some darkness had entered Sarah's life and stolen her voice. And Jennifer was determined to find out what it was, no matter what she had to do. She watched Sarah continue to color, the princess now wearing a pink dress. Her daughter's face was blank, emotionless, mechanical. Where was her little songbird? Where was the girl who'd sung everywhere, who'd talked constantly, who'd laughed with complete abandon? That little girl was still in there somewhere, Jennifer was certain. Trapped inside the silent shell that had become her daughter, screaming without sound, waiting for someone to hear her. Jennifer set down her cold coffee and made a decision. Tomorrow, she would start calling specialists, real specialists, people trained to understand trauma, people who knew how to reach children who'd stopped speaking. She didn't know exactly what had happened, but she knew it was her job as a mother to uncover it. And she would do whatever it took to bring her daughter's voice back home. Doctor's office didn't look like a typical medical space. Located in a converted Victorian home in downtown Nashville, it was painted in soft, calming colors, sage green walls, natural wooden floors, windows that overlooked a garden. The waiting room held an eclectic collection of children's books, art supplies, and toys. When Jennifer had called the office weeks earlier, desperation thick in her voice. The receptionist had squeezed Sarah in for an appointment within 4 days. Doctor came highly recommended, a speech and language pathologist who specialized in trauma-informed care for children, particularly those who'd experienced significant stress or abuse. Jennifer sat in the waiting room during Sarah's first appointment, her hands twisted together in her lap. Through the partially open door, she could see Doctor on the floor with Sarah, simply playing with blocks, not forcing interaction, just allowing Sarah to be in his presence. He seemed different from the other doctors, less clinical, more intuitive. He didn't wear a white coat. He moved slowly and spoke softly. When Sarah handed him a block, he smiled genuinely and thanked her, treating her gesture as the significant communication it was. That first session lasted 45 minutes. When Sarah emerged, she looked the same, still quiet, still withdrawn, but something in the energy had shifted slightly. Doctor had pulled Jennifer aside. "Your daughter is intelligent and observant," he'd said carefully. "She's communicating, just not verbally right now. That's significant. Let's continue working with her." By the third session, something remarkable was beginning to happen. Sarah sat in Doctor's office on a Tuesday afternoon, the autumn light filtering through the windows in golden streams. The space was designed to feel safe, cushions on the floor, a low table with toys arranged carefully, and in a corner a small dollhouse with furniture and figures. Doctor had learned that Sarah responded best when left alone to explore rather than when asked direct questions. He didn't push. He didn't probe. He simply made space for her. On this particular day, Sarah gravitated toward the dollhouse. She'd ignored it in previous sessions, but today something drew her to it. She picked up the tiny figures, a mother doll, a father doll, a child doll, and an adult male doll labeled Uncle. Doctor continued organizing art supplies across the room, appearing absorbed in his own task, but his attention was entirely focused on Sarah. At first, she simply arranged the dolls in different rooms. The mother and child in the bedroom, the uncle in the living room, the father away. She moved them around repeatedly as if trying different configurations, testing different scenarios. Her tiny face was concentrated, serious. Then, almost imperceptibly, she began to narrate. Her voice was barely audible, a whisper so faint that Doctor had to lean forward to hear. But he heard it. "The man hurts the girl doll," Sarah whispered, moving the uncle figure toward the child figure. "The man hurts the girl doll here, in the room." Doctor's entire body went rigid. Every instinct screamed at him to react, to ask questions, to demand details. But his training, years of studying trauma-informed care, of understanding the fragility of a child's willingness to disclose, kept him still. He continued his task, moving slowly, keeping his voice absolutely neutral when he finally spoke. "Tell me more about the dolls," he said quietly, not turning around. "What's happening with them?" Sarah moved the figures again, her hands trembled. "The girl doll cries," she continued in her tiny voice. "The man tells the girl doll, tells her, 'Don't tell mommy, it's our secret.' The man says if she tells, bad things happen." Doctor's hands trembled as he arranged supplies. His mind was racing, but his exterior remained calm, safe, non-threatening. He turned slowly and sat on the floor at a respectful distance from Sarah, not too close, not making it seem like an interrogation. "The girl doll is very brave," he said softly. "What else is happening in the story?" For the next 30 minutes, Sarah narrated a deeply disturbing account using the dolls as her medium. She described specific acts, nothing she should have known about, nothing a 3-year-old should possess vocabulary or understanding for. She described pain, she described fear. She described threats and coercion. She described locations, a bedroom with a blue blanket, a bathroom, a basement. She named her attacker, though not in words at first. She pointed to the uncle figure and said, "That man. He comes to the house, he watches me." Doctor documented everything in his mind, careful not to ask leading questions, not to suggest details, simply allowing Sarah to communicate what she needed to communicate. When she seemed to run out of words, he didn't push. He simply continued sitting nearby, a steady, safe presence. "Thank you for telling me," he said finally. "You're very brave." Sarah looked at him, and for the first time in months, something shifted in her eyes. Not happiness, too much had been stolen for that, but something like relief. Someone had heard her. Someone had believed her. She wasn't completely alone anymore. When Jennifer arrived to pick up Sarah, Doctor's expression told her everything before he said a word. He asked her to wait while he got Sarah settled in the waiting room, then pulled Jennifer into his office and carefully, methodically, reported everything Sarah had disclosed. Jennifer felt the room spin. Her worst fears, the nightmares that had plagued her, were confirmed. Her daughter had been abused. Her baby had been violated. "We need to call the police," Jennifer said, her voice shaking. "Yes," Doctor agreed. "But first, I need to explain something important. What Sarah disclosed today, it's significant and detailed. She used sophisticated language and described specific acts without prompting. That's good from an investigative standpoint. However, we need to be very careful about how we proceed. Every interview, every question, every interaction with authority figures can be traumatic for her. We should document everything, follow proper protocols, and ensure that all future interviews are conducted by trained professionals who understand trauma." Over the next 3 days, Doctor created a comprehensive video recording of Sarah's disclosure, conducted with meticulous attention to trauma-informed protocol. He asked open-ended questions. He didn't suggest details. He let Sarah set the pace. The result was a stunning and devastating account, not perfect, with some contradictions and gaps, but coherent and detailed enough to be credible. When Detective James reviewed the video, his expression hardened. He'd been investigating child abuse cases for 12 years, and he recognized the markers of truthful disclosure, the specific details, the emotional authenticity, the contextual accuracy. This child had experienced something terrible. Jennifer watched Detective as he reviewed the video, studying his face for hope, for reassurance. "Is this enough?" she asked, her voice small. "Can you arrest him?" Took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "It's a good start," he said carefully, "but we're going to face some challenges." "What kind of challenges?" Jennifer demanded, fear rising in her throat. Hesitated. Sarah is 3 years old. In court, a defense attorney will argue she's too young to testify reliably. They'll claim she's been coached or that her imagination is creating false memories. They'll attack her credibility relentlessly. We need corroborating evidence, physical evidence, witnesses, something concrete to support what she's saying. Jennifer felt cold dread settling in her stomach. Here was her daughter, finally speaking, finally disclosing what had happened to her, and already the system was telling her that her daughter's words might not be enough, that a child's trauma might be deemed unreliable, that justice might not be possible. But at least now she had something. At least now Sarah had found her voice, even if it was whispered through toy dolls in a therapist's office. At least now someone with authority had heard her and believed her. Doctor assured Jennifer that this was just the beginning. "Sarah has been incredibly brave," he said. "She's broken the silence. Whatever happens next that matters. We'll support her through this. I promise." Jennifer held those words close as she drove home with Sarah silent in her car seat. Her daughter had spoken. Now, the question was whether anyone would listen. The prosecutor's office was located in a gray concrete building downtown, its walls lined with photographs of past cases and commendations. Assistant District Attorney Robert had worked there for 20 years, prosecuting everything from drug offenses to homicides. He was respected, competent, and dedicated to justice. But as he sat in his office reviewing Sarah Mitchell's case file for the 100th time, he felt something he rarely experienced: absolute frustration. On his desk lay the video recording of Sarah's disclosure, 45 minutes of a 3-year-old describing abuse in disturbing detail. There were police reports documenting Jennifer's concerns dating back months. There was medical documentation of Sarah's behavioral changes and trauma symptoms. There was doctor's expert assessment confirming indicators of childhood sexual abuse. And there was Uncle David Mitchell, arrested and released on bail, awaiting trial while maintaining his innocence. By any reasonable measure, this should be a strong case. By legal standards in most developed nations, the evidence would be compelling. But in Tennessee, in 2019, Robert knew he faced what many prosecutors faced when the victim was very young, a credibility crisis that no amount of evidence could completely resolve. He called a meeting with Detective James and Jennifer Mitchell. They sat in a small conference room, fluorescent lights humming overhead, the air heavy with tension. Robert wanted to be honest, even if honesty was painful. "Your daughter's disclosure is compelling," he began carefully, choosing his words with precision. "The details are specific. The emotional content is authentic. As someone who's been doing this for 2 decades, my gut tells me she's telling the truth, but we have a problem." "What problem?" Jennifer asked, though something in her expression suggested she already knew. "Sarah is 3 years old," Robert said, and he watched Jennifer's face collapse slightly. "In court, Tennessee law requires that witnesses be competent to testify. That means they must understand the difference between truth and lies. They must be able to perceive and remember events accurately, and they must be able to communicate clearly. For a 3-year-old, all 3 of those things are legally questionable." "But she's telling the truth." Jennifer's voice rose in desperation. "You can see she's traumatized. You can see this really happened to her." "I believe that," Robert said gently. "But belief isn't evidence in court. A defense attorney, and David's attorney is expensive and experienced, will argue that your daughter is too young to reliably distinguish between imagination and reality. They'll argue that her memory is fragmented and unreliable. They'll suggest that leading questions or adult expectations have planted false memories. They'll claim she's been coached, either consciously or unconsciously." Detective leaned forward. "What about the physical evidence? We did a full medical exam." Robert sighed. The medical exam showed some nonspecific findings consistent with trauma, but nothing definitively diagnostic of sexual abuse. The defense will argue that children can have similar findings from innocent causes. Without concrete physical evidence, we're left relying primarily on the child's testimony. "So what are you saying?" Jennifer asked, her voice small and terrified. "That we can't prosecute him, that he just gets away with this?" "I'm saying we have significant challenges," Robert replied carefully, "and we need to think strategically about how to proceed. We could move forward with prosecution based on Sarah's testimony, but I won't lie to you. Conviction rates for cases relying primarily on very young children's testimony are extremely low. Defense attorneys are skilled at making children appear confused or unreliable, even when they're not. They can be aggressive in cross-examination in ways that traumatize the child further." Jennifer felt the room tilt. She'd imagined this moment, imagined justice, imagined her daughter's attacker being held accountable. Now the system was telling her that her daughter's own words might not be sufficient. Over the next 3 months, the investigation stalled. Evidence was requested, reviewed, and found insufficient. Witness interviews yielded little. David had been careful, had isolated Sarah, had made her complicit through threats and manipulation. The case seemed destined to collapse under the weight of legal precedent and the fundamental legal problem of a 3-year-old victim. And as the case stalled, Sarah deteriorated. The nightmares became worse. She'd wake up screaming in the darkness, her small body drenched in sweat, crying for her mother. When Jennifer held her trying to comfort her, Sarah's body would remain rigid, resistant to comfort. She had regressed significantly. After months of being mostly toilet-trained, she began having accidents again, wearing pull-ups like a much younger child. She stopped eating regularly. Her weight, which had been healthy and normal, began to drop. She lost interest in the few activities that had brought her joy. More disturbing was her behavior during the police interviews and the multiple follow-up appointments with Dr. Each time an authority figure asked her to recount her experiences, She became more withdrawn, more traumatized. The legal system designed to protect her was, ironically, victimizing her repeatedly. She had to tell her story over and over again, to detective, to forensic interviewers, to doctor, to medical examiners. Each retelling required her to relive the trauma. Each interview was another wound. Jennifer watched her daughter disappearing. The spark that had briefly flickered during doctor's office, that moment when Sarah had spoken and been believed, was being extinguished by the machinery of justice itself. Sarah had fewer words now, not more. She'd regressed to almost complete silence again, but this time it wasn't protective silence. It was broken silence. It was a child who'd learned that speaking didn't actually lead to safety. Jennifer sat in the prosecutor's office again, this time without Sarah, 3 months into the case. Robert looked as exhausted as she felt. "I'm recommending we drop the charges," he said quietly. Jennifer felt the words like a physical blow. "What? No, you can't do that." "We can, and frankly, I think we should," Robert said, his voice heavy with the weight of a prosecutor who'd learned to accept that sometimes the system failed. "Proceeding to trial with Sarah as our primary witness will traumatize her further. The defense will crucify her on the stand. She'll be cross-examined aggressively, asked questions designed to confuse her, made to appear unreliable. And there's a strong possibility we'll lose anyway. I've seen it happen too many times." "So he just walks free?" Jennifer asked, her voice hollow. "Not necessarily," Robert said. "If new evidence emerges, if more victims come forward, we can reopen the case. Statute of limitations doesn't apply to child sexual abuse, but right now, proceeding is more likely to harm Sarah than help her." Jennifer left the prosecutor's office in a daze. The system that was supposed to protect her daughter had instead failed her spectacularly. The truth that Sarah had finally found the courage to speak was being deemed legally insufficient. The perpetrator remained free, and her daughter, traumatized and broken, had learned that even telling the truth didn't guarantee safety or justice. That night, Jennifer sat beside Sarah's bed while her daughter thrashed through another nightmare. She held her daughter's small hand and made a silent vow. She didn't know what she would do, but she knew one thing for certain: she would not accept this. Her daughter's voice had to mean something. Justice couldn't simply fail like this. There had to be another way. What Jennifer didn't know was that help was already coming. A journalist named Tors was beginning to investigate the pattern she was experiencing, the thousands of similar cases across the country where children's voices went unheard. The system was about to face a reckoning. But first, Sarah would have to endure more suffering, and Jennifer would have to find strength she didn't know she possessed. The silence had returned, but this time, it was the silence of a system that refused to listen. Tors had been a journalist for 32 years, and he'd learned that the best stories were often hiding in plain sight. They weren't the sensational headlines that grabbed attention immediately. They were the quiet tragedies that repeated so consistently that people had stopped noticing them. He'd won numerous awards for his investigative work, exposing corruption in city government, documenting environmental disasters, unraveling financial fraud. But as he sat in his office at the Nashville Gazette on a gray Tuesday afternoon, reviewing court documents for what he thought would be a routine piece about local crime statistics, he encountered a story that would consume the next 6 months of his life. He'd been researching child abuse cases for an article about crime trends when he stumbled upon Sarah Mitchell's case. What caught his attention initially was the dismissal. Why would prosecutors drop charges based on a child's credible disclosure? He requested the court documents, reviewed the psychiatric evaluations, watched portions of Sarah's recorded statements. Something about it bothered him deeply. The child's account was consistent, detailed, and emotionally authentic. The dismissal seemed like a failure, not a legal necessity. Began asking questions. He called the prosecutor's office and spoke with Robert, who was surprisingly candid about the systemic limitations he faced. He interviewed defense attorneys who explained, with apparent satisfaction, how easy it was to discredit child witnesses. He talked to judges who admitted, off the record, that they were constrained by legal precedent that treated children's testimony as inherently unreliable. The more he learned, the more his journalistic instincts fired. This was a systemic problem, not an isolated incident. He began searching databases of child abuse cases across Tennessee. What he found was staggering. Hundreds of cases involving child victims had been dropped, diverted, or resulted in acquittals. In case after case, the pattern was identical. A child discloses abuse, the child's credibility is questioned, the case falters. Predators walked free because the system had decided that children's voices weren't reliable enough to trust. But didn't stop there. He contacted colleagues at other newspapers, journalists he'd met at conferences, contacts in the criminal justice system across the country. He asked them to look into their own records. The response was consistent and chilling. This wasn't a Tennessee problem. This was a national crisis. Over 3 months, conducted interviews with more than 200 people, prosecutors who'd abandoned cases, defense attorneys, judges, child psychologists, parents of abuse victims, and survivors who'd grown to adulthood carrying the trauma of having their abuse dismissed by the very system meant to protect them. He reviewed international case law and discovered something shocking. Other countries had solved this problem. England, Canada, and Australia had reformed their legal systems years ago to better accommodate child witnesses while still protecting defendants' rights. They used specialized interview protocols. They allowed closed-circuit testimony. They trained investigators in trauma-informed techniques, and their conviction rates in child abuse cases were dramatically higher than America's. The more learned, the more he understood that Sarah Mitchell's case wasn't about Sarah at all. It was about a fundamental failure of the American legal system to evolve, to acknowledge that children could provide reliable testimony if given appropriate accommodations, to prioritize child protection over abstract legal theory. He began writing. His first draft was 20,000 words. He cut it down, refined it, gave it to editors who initially seemed skeptical. "This is a big story," one editor said hesitantly. "Are you sure you have enough evidence? This will upset a lot of people." Good replied, "It should." The Nashville Gazette published the first article in the 6-part series on a Sunday morning in March. The headline read, "Silent Victims: How America's Justice System Abandons Children Part 1, the Legal System That Protects Predators." The response was immediate and overwhelming. By Monday afternoon, the story had been shared 50,000 times on social media. By Tuesday, national news outlets were picking it up. By Wednesday, politicians were calling for comment. His phone rang constantly. Interviews were requested. Other journalists began investigating similar patterns in their own states. The subsequent articles in the series were equally explosive. Part 2 detailed specific cases where children had been disbelieved, and predators had gone on to abuse other children. Part 3 examined how other countries had reformed their systems successfully. Part 4 analyzed the legal precedents that were keeping America stuck in the past. Part 5 featured interviews with child psychologists explaining why children's testimony about trauma was actually highly reliable when properly elicited. Part 6 proposed specific legislative solutions. But the most powerful piece was an extended profile of Sarah Mitchell, with her identity protected but her story told in excruciating detail. Described the irony. A child who had finally found the courage to speak, who had disclosed her abuse clearly and consistently, had been abandoned by the system and re-traumatized by the legal process itself. He quoted Jennifer Mitchell, her mother's voice raw with emotion. "My daughter spoke. She told the truth." And the system told her that her truth wasn't good enough. What message does that send to children about justice? The series ignited a firestorm. Child advocacy organizations mobilized. Survivor networks began sharing their own stories. Social media campaigns emerged with hashtags like Believe Children and Justice for Sarah. Academic institutions issued statements supporting legal reform. The American Psychological Association, released a brief supporting the reliability of children's trauma disclosures. Major news networks sent reporters to Nashville to interview prosecutors, judges, and advocates. Crucially, politicians started paying attention. Senator Richardson, a moderate Republican with strong support from victims' advocates in her district, called to schedule an interview. "We need to fix this," she said. "How quickly can we move on legislation?" Within 2 weeks of the final article's publication, the Nashville District Attorney's Office announced they were reopening Sarah Mitchell's case. The prosecutor who'd initially recommended dismissal, Robert, issued a statement saying that the public discourse generated by his reporting had convinced him that proceeding with prosecution was both legally possible and morally necessary. They would go to trial, he said, but with new strategies and expert testimony designed to support rather than traumatize the child witness. David Mitchell's defense attorney, sensing the shift in public opinion, began negotiating a plea deal. Within a month, he pleaded guilty to a lesser charge, a strategic move designed to minimize his sentence before the trial that would likely result in far more serious convictions given the national spotlight on the case. But Torres understood that the legal victory in Sarah's case was less important than the systemic change that might follow. He continued investigating, continued writing, continued documenting the crisis. His series was picked up by the prize committee. In May, he'd won the for investigative reporting. When journalists asked him about the award, was clear about one thing: "This isn't my story to own. This is Sarah Mitchell's story. This is the story of thousands of children whose voices have been ignored. I just had the privilege of amplifying what they've been trying to say all along." But amplification was everything. A child's whispered words in a therapist's office hadn't changed anything. A child's detailed disclosure to police hadn't changed anything. But a child's story told to millions of readers had triggered a seismic shift in how America thought about justice, childhood, and truth. Sarah Mitchell still didn't know who Torres was. She remained anonymous, her identity protected by legal proceedings. But her case, through Torres' reporting, had become the catalyst for something far larger than one family's tragedy. The silence was beginning to break. Justice was beginning to evolve. And it all started because one journalist decided to listen. The courtroom was packed. Every seat was filled, and people lined the walls and hallway outside, eager for any glimpse of the trial that had captured national attention. News cameras were stationed outside the courthouse, reporters rehearsing their segments. This wasn't just a local case anymore. It was a referendum on the American justice system's ability to protect its most vulnerable citizens. Sarah sat in a small room adjacent to the courtroom, separated from the proceedings by closed-circuit television. She was 4 years old now. The case had taken longer than anyone anticipated, wearing a pink dress that Jennifer had chosen carefully. Not too formal, not too casual, just a little girl's dress. She sat beside Doctor, who would remain with her throughout her testimony, a steady, familiar presence. Jennifer sat in the gallery, her hands clenched so tightly her fingernails cut into her palms. The prosecutor, Robert, had prepared extensively for this moment. He'd consulted with experts on trauma-informed questioning. He'd worked with Sarah multiple times to ensure she understood the process. And he'd assembled an extraordinary team of expert witnesses who would testify about the reliability of children's disclosures and the neurobiology of childhood trauma. The defense attorney, Richard, expensive, experienced, and skilled at his craft, sat with David Mitchell, who maintained an expression of injured innocence. Strategy was clear. Discredit the child, emphasize the dangers of leading questions, suggest that well-intentioned adults had planted false memories. The trial began with opening statements. Robert laid out the case methodically, describing Sarah's disclosure, the consistency of her account, the specific details that matched physical evidence. Then stood, spreading his hands in an expression of concern. "This case," he said, "is built entirely on the testimony of a 4-year-old child, A child who has been questioned repeatedly, whose story has been reviewed and rehearsed, whose memory has been shaped by suggestions from adults around her. We must consider the possibility that despite everyone's good intentions, a false memory has been created. The first expert witness was Dr. a renowned child psychologist from university who specialized in trauma and memory in children. She about how childhood trauma affects memory formation, that traumatized children often have fragmented but accurate core memories of abuse. She explained that detailed, specific knowledge about sexual acts couldn't be explained by imagination in a 4-year-old. She discussed the difference between leading questions that plant false memories and open-ended questions that allow children to disclose genuine experiences. Under cross-examination was aggressive. Isn't it true, doctor, that children are highly suggestible, that they can be influenced by adult expectations? Children can be influenced by leading questions, doctor agreed. But that's different from a child who provides detailed, consistent, and contextually accurate information about traumatic events in response to open-ended questions. Sarah's disclosures fit the pattern of genuine trauma disclosure, not the pattern of false memory creation. The second expert was Dr. Daniel, a forensic neurologist from Johns, who about the neurobiology of trauma memory in young children. He explained how the amygdala, the brain's fear center, becomes hyperactive in traumatized children, creating vivid, fragmented memories of traumatic events. He described how the prefrontal cortex, responsible for logical reasoning and false memory creation, is less developed in young children, but that this doesn't mean traumatic memories are unreliable. It means they're stored differently, often in sensory and emotional form rather than narrative form. So when Sarah described specific details about what happened, Robert asked, what does that tell us? It tells us that her brain encoded those details during a traumatic event, Doctor explained. The sensory and emotional vividness of traumatic memory makes it highly resistant to forgetting, even in very young children. Then came the legal expert, Professor Williams from law school, about how other countries, England, Canada, Australia, had reformed their legal systems to accommodate child witnesses. She described the specific mechanisms: closed-circuit testimony, trained interviewers, pre-recorded statements, expert testimony about trauma. She explained that these accommodations had not weakened justice. They'd strengthened it by improving conviction rates while protecting vulnerable witnesses. Professor Williams, Robert asked, do these international approaches compromise the defendant's right to a fair trial? Not at all, she replied. They simply recognize that a fair trial can be achieved without re-traumatizing a child victim. The defendant still has the right to cross-examination through an attorney. The evidence is still subjected to rigorous scrutiny, but the process accommodates the developmental needs of the witness. Then it was time for Sarah to testify. She appeared on the monitor in the courtroom, tiny in a chair designed for her size, doctor sitting beside her. Her voice was soft, her answers careful. Robert asked open-ended questions designed to let her tell her story without suggestion. Sarah, can you tell me what happened? The man came to my house, Sarah said, her voice small but steady. He took me to his room, he hurt me. He said, don't tell mommy. How did he hurt you? Sarah hesitated, looking at doctor for reassurance. Then she provided details, specific, clinical, and heartbreaking. She described what had happened to her body, where it happened, when it happened, how she felt. She named her attacker clearly, Uncle David. Sarah, did anyone teach you these words? Robert asked gently. No, Sarah said, I just know. Then came the cross-examination. Richard approached cautiously, too aggressive, and he'd lose the jury, too soft, and he wouldn't plant reasonable doubt. Sarah, do you remember talking to lots of grown-ups about what happened? Yes, Sarah said. And each time you talked about it, did the grown-ups sometimes ask you questions that made you think about it differently? I don't know, Sarah said quietly. Did anyone ever show you pictures or ask you questions about things that might have happened? Some people asked questions, Sarah said. Pressed further, trying to suggest leading questions, trying to create reasonable doubt. But Sarah remained remarkably consistent. Her details didn't change. Her core account remained solid. And importantly, crucially, when asked about things that hadn't happened, Sarah said no clearly. She didn't simply agree with suggestions. She distinguished between what had actually occurred and what hadn't. After 20 minutes of cross-examination, Sarah was excused. She'd been believed. She'd held her ground. The defense called no witnesses. They couldn't put David on the stand. That would expose him to direct examination about the allegations, and his story had too many holes. Instead, they relied on their discredit the witness strategy, hoping the jury would doubt Sarah. The closing arguments were passionate. Robert stood before the jury, speaking directly. "This little girl told you the truth," he said. "She told it consistently, clearly, and bravely. She faced questions designed to confuse her, and she didn't waver. What we heard from her was not the product of false memory or leading questions. What we heard was a child bearing witness to her own trauma." Richard countered, "Ladies, and I don't dispute that something happened to this child. Something caused her trauma. But can we be absolutely certain it was my client? Can we be absolutely certain that a 4-year-old's memory, shaped by repeated questioning, is reliable enough to convict someone of these serious charges?" The jury deliberated for 13 hours. They asked to review portions of Sarah's testimony. They asked for jury instructions about child witness credibility. They requested clarification about reasonable doubt. On the afternoon of the second day, they returned. "We find the defendant guilty on all counts," the foreman announced. The courtroom erupted. Jennifer collapsed into tears. Sarah, watching from the adjacent room, didn't fully understand what had happened, but she understood that something significant had shifted. Adults were crying, some with joy, some with relief. The man who had hurt her had been held accountable. That night Jennifer held her daughter close. "You were so brave," she whispered. "You were so brave." Sarah didn't fully understand what justice meant. She didn't understand that the legal system had, for the first time, believed her completely. What she understood on some deep cellular level was that she'd spoken truth, and for once, finally, someone had listened and acted. The verdict rippled outward. News outlets ran stories about the conviction. Victim advocates celebrated. And crucially, legislators began taking reform seriously. The verdict proved something important. Children could testify reliably. Justice could be served. The system could evolve. But for Sarah and Jennifer, the most important moment came later that evening, when Sarah looked at her mother and for the first time in nearly 2 years sang. Just a few notes. Broken and uncertain, but unmistakably a song. The girl who couldn't speak had finally found her voice, and the world had finally learned to listen. 3 months after David Mitchell's conviction, Senator Richardson stood in the Tennessee state capitol with a thick legislative document in her hands. The bill had been drafted over the previous 8 weeks by a coalition of prosecutors, judges, child psychologists, victims advocates, and legal scholars. It was comprehensive, detailed, and revolutionary. And it bore a name that would become historic, the Sarah Mitchell Act. Senator Richardson called a press conference on the steps of the Capitol. Dozens of journalists, advocates, and concerned citizens gathered to hear her speak. She held up the document, its pages dog-eared and annotated with months of revision. "This legislation," she began, her voice steady and clear, "represents our collective commitment to a simple principle. Children deserve to have their truth heard and protected by the justice system. For too long, we have operated under legal assumptions that treated children's testimony as inherently unreliable. The evidence, both from our own cases like Sarah Mitchell's and from successful reforms in other countries, shows us that those assumptions were wrong." The Sarah Mitchell Act included several revolutionary provisions. First, It established special interview protocols for child witnesses in abuse cases. All initial interviews would be conducted by trained professionals using open-ended questioning techniques designed to minimize suggestion and false memory creation. These interviews would be video recorded, preserved, and admissible in court. Second, the act allowed for closed-circuit television testimony for child victims. Instead of facing the accused in open court, an environment proven to be traumatic and memory-disrupting, children could testify via monitor from a comfortable room with a supportive adult present. The defendant retained the right to cross-examination through their attorney, but the process was fundamentally more humane. Third, the legislation made expert testimony about child trauma and memory admissible in all cases involving child witnesses. Prosecutors could now educate jurors about how trauma affected memory formation, why children's disclosures about abuse were reliable, and how the legal system needed to accommodate children's developmental needs. Fourth, the act created victim support services specifically designed for child witnesses. Therapists, advocates, and support coordinators would work with children throughout the legal process, ensuring their emotional and psychological needs were met alongside the pursuit of justice. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, the legislation removed the requirement that child witnesses be subjected to traditional examinations before testifying. Instead, judges would assess in more developmentally appropriate ways, recognizing that even very young children could testify reliably about their own experiences. The bill passed the Tennessee Senate with overwhelming bipartisan support, 43-7. It passed the House with similar margins. Governor Bill signed it into law on a sunny April afternoon, with Sarah Mitchell's mother Jennifer standing nearby, though Sarah herself remained anonymous, her identity protected throughout the legal proceedings. "We are sending a clear message to every child in Tennessee," Governor said at the signing ceremony. "Your voice matters. Your truth matters. This government will protect you and believe you." But the impact didn't stop in Tennessee. Within weeks, other states began reaching out to Tennessee legislators, asking for copies of the legislation, wanting to adapt it for their own legal systems. Child advocacy organizations across the country mobilized, demanding similar reforms. Prosecutors' associations began publishing best practices based on the Act's provisions. Law schools updated their curricula to teach trauma-informed approaches to child witness testimony. By the end of the first year, 12 states had passed similar legislation. By the end of the second year, that number had grown to 38. Each state adapted the core principles to fit their own legal systems, but the fundamental message was consistent. Children's voices deserve to be heard, protected, and believed. Dr. the speech therapist who had first heard Sarah speak in his office, established the National Institute for Trauma-Informed Child Interviewing. Located in Nashville, the institute provided training to prosecutors, police officers, social workers, and therapists from across the country. By the end of 5 years, over 10,000 professionals had been trained in his methods. The success rate was undeniable. States implementing the protocols saw conviction rates in child abuse cases increase by an average of 40%. Judge Harold, the initially skeptical judge from Sarah's original case, became a national leader in judicial reform. He wrote articles for legal journals. He appeared at conferences explaining how judges could balance defendants' rights with victim protection. He became an unlikely advocate for changing a legal system he'd once believed was working as intended. Speaking at a conference 2 years after Sarah's trial, Judge was candid about his evolution. "I came to this case believing that the legal system had it right," he said. "I believed that protecting defendants' rights meant making it difficult for children to testify. I was wrong. What I learned through Sarah's case was that we could protect both. We could ensure fair trials for defendants while also protecting vulnerable witnesses. It required us to evolve, to challenge our assumptions, but it was possible." Prosecutor Robert began traveling nationally, speaking before bar associations and law enforcement conferences about prosecuting child abuse cases in the post-reform era. He published a comprehensive manual for prosecutors titled Believing Children, a guide to modern child abuse prosecution. The manual became the standard reference in prosecutors' offices across the country. The American Academy of Pediatrics revised its guidelines for identifying and reporting child abuse, incorporating the latest research on trauma responses and the reliability of children's disclosures. The American Psychological Association released multiple briefs supporting the legislative reforms. Major universities began conducting research on the effectiveness of the new protocols, and the results were consistently positive. But perhaps the most important shift was cultural. Slowly, imperceptibly but definitely, American attitudes about children's testimony began to change. The default assumption that children were unreliable was replaced by a more nuanced understanding. Children could provide accurate testimony about their own experiences if given appropriate support and accommodation. Television shows and movies began reflecting this shift. Legal dramas that had once featured defense attorneys easily discrediting child witnesses now showed more realistic portrayals of how trauma-informed justice worked. Educational materials in schools began teaching children that adults would believe them if they disclosed abuse. Therapy training programs updated their approaches based on new understanding of how to work with traumatized children. 5 years after the verdict, crime investigators and prosecutors reported a dramatic shift in how child abuse cases were handled. More victims were willing to come forward. More cases were being prosecuted successfully. More offenders were being held accountable. And crucially, more child victims were receiving appropriate support rather than additional trauma from the legal process. Journalist Torres, who had won the prize for exposing the systemic failure, continued investigating and writing about child protection issues. His follow-up book, Speaking Truth: How One Child's Voice Changed America's Justice System, became a bestseller and was adopted in law schools and criminology programs across the country. Doctor reflected on the changes during an interview 5 years after Sarah's disclosure. "When Sarah first spoke to me," he said, "she was terrified. She'd been silenced, traumatized, and the system that was supposed to protect her had failed her. But her courage, her willingness to speak despite everything, became the catalyst for change that affected hundreds of thousands of children. That's what I think about when I'm training professionals now. Every child's voice matters. Every disclosure could be the one that changes everything." The Sarah Mitchell Act had become more than legislation. It had become a symbol of how one child's courage could literally transform a nation. It represented the moment when America's justice system finally evolved to listen to its most vulnerable citizens. It was a reminder that sometimes systemic change requires someone willing to speak truth to power, even if that someone is only 4 years old. And though Sarah remained anonymous, protected from the spotlight, her impact was undeniable. The girl who couldn't speak had, through her terrible ordeal and her ultimate willingness to testify, given voice to thousands of other children. Justice was no longer failing them. The system had finally learned to listen. The therapeutic journal sat on Doctor's desk, filled with Sarah's careful drawings and the occasional word. Sarah was now 8 years old, and though years had passed since the trial, though legislation bearing her name had transformed the justice system, the girl herself remained profoundly broken in ways that no verdict could repair. Doctor, a child psychiatrist specializing in complex trauma, reviewed the latest drawings with concern. They showed a familiar pattern: dark colors, isolated figures, images of doors locked and windows barred. Sarah drew safety mechanisms obsessively: locks, chains, adults standing guard. In her artistic language, she was expressing something her verbal language still struggled to articulate. She didn't feel safe. She didn't know if she ever would. The sessions occurred twice a week, had occurred twice a week for 5 years, and would likely continue indefinitely. Complex post-traumatic stress disorder, doctor had explained to Jennifer, was not something that resolved quickly or completely. It was something Sarah would manage for the rest of her life. The neural pathways created by early childhood trauma were deeply embedded. Healing would be slow, partial, and perpetual. Beyond the twice-weekly sessions with Dr. Sarah also saw a trauma-specialized occupational therapist once weekly to address sensory processing issues. She took medication for anxiety, a small pink pill that sometimes helped, sometimes didn't. She'd been enrolled in a special school program designed for children with significant emotional and behavioral challenges. She couldn't manage a regular classroom. The fluorescent lights, the sudden noises, the proximity of other children, all of it triggered her nervous system into fight-or-flight responses that made learning impossible. Jennifer had quit her job entirely to manage Sarah's care. She'd initially taken leave, hoping to return after the trial concluded, but the reality of Sarah's needs made that impossible. Her daughter required constant vigilance, constant support, constant reassurance. There were good days when Sarah seemed almost like a normal child, playing with toys, laughing at jokes. But there were also terrible days when she regressed into complete silence, when she had flashbacks so severe she became unresponsive, when she acted out her trauma through disturbing play scenarios or violent outbursts. The financial costs were staggering. Therapy was expensive and insurance didn't cover most of what Sarah needed. Medical bills accumulated. The medications cost hundreds of dollars monthly. Jennifer had maxed out her savings within 2 years of the trial. She'd taken out loans. She'd sold her car and purchased a used one. She'd moved to a smaller house. They lived frugally, but it still wasn't enough. The Victim Assistance Fund provided some support, about $2,000 annually, designed to help cover costs that had directly resulted from the crime. It was a gesture, but it was grossly insufficient for a child requiring comprehensive, long-term trauma care. Jennifer had applied for disability benefits for Sarah, a process that took 18 months and was ultimately on appeal. "Your daughter is able to attend school and participate in some activities," the denial letter stated, apparently unaware that participating meant sitting in a specialized classroom where she often sat mute and unresponsive. Then there was the social cost. The case had been sealed, Sarah's identity protected, but in their small community people knew. Neighbors whispered. Some parents their children from Sarah's social sphere as if trauma were contagious. When Sarah was invited to birthday parties, rare occurrences, she would often have panic attacks or behavioral episodes that resulted in Jennifer having to pick her up early. Eventually, the invitations stopped coming. School was particularly difficult. Teachers, despite training programs about trauma-informed education, often interpreted Sarah's symptoms as behavioral problems. Her selective mutism in certain environments was seen as defiance. Her anxiety-driven avoidance of certain tasks was interpreted as laziness. One teacher suggested that Jennifer was coddling Sarah, and that what she really needed was stricter discipline. The conversation had ended with Jennifer pulling her daughter from that classroom and demanding a transfer. Friendships were nearly impossible. Sarah couldn't trust easily, couldn't engage in the casual physical contact that children engaged in, couldn't relax enough to play the way other children played. By 3rd grade, she had no close friends. She ate lunch alone. She spent recess standing apart from the other children, watching but never joining. The nightmares persisted. 5 years after the trial, Sarah still woke up screaming 3 to 4 nights per week. Sometimes she remembered the nightmares, fragments of dreams about being chased, about being trapped, about the man who hurt her. Other times she woke in terror without knowing why. Jennifer would sit beside her bed, holding her daughter's trembling hand until she fell back asleep. She'd done this hundreds of times. She would likely do it hundreds more times. Sarah also struggled with an unhealthy awareness of her own body. She remained anxious about bathing, resistant to physical examinations, hypervigilant about boundaries. At 8 years old, she understood too much about adult violence. She'd been robbed of innocence in a way that no legislation could restore. By year 6 after the trial, Jennifer made a decision. She couldn't change what had happened to her daughter. She couldn't erase the trauma or guarantee Sarah's healing, but she could try to prevent other children from experiencing similar failures of the support system. She founded the Nashville Children's Advocacy Foundation, initially working part-time from her home while maintaining Sarah's care schedule. The foundation's mission was multifaceted. First, it advocated for comprehensive victim support services. Jennifer discovered that while legal reform had improved prosecutions, victim support had not kept pace. Most jurisdictions had no therapists specifically trained in childhood trauma. Most had no advocates who could walk families through the legal process. Most had inadequate financial assistance for families bankrupted by their children's cases. The foundation began training programs for victim advocates and therapists. It created resource guides for families navigating the legal system. It established a fund to help cover therapy costs not covered by insurance or victim assistance. Within 2 years, the foundation had helped over 300 families. But Jennifer's real focus was on systemic reform around victim support. She began advocating for legislation requiring states to provide comprehensive mental health services to child abuse victims, services that continued for as long as necessary, not for an arbitrary time period. She pushed for funding dedicated to family support during legal proceedings, paying for lost wages, transportation, housing stability. She argued, powerfully and persistently, that justice meant nothing if victims were destroyed in the process of seeking it. Speaking at a national conference on child protection, Jennifer was raw and honest about the costs of justice. "My daughter," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "She was believed. The man who hurt her was convicted and imprisoned. By every legal measure, justice was served, but my daughter is still traumatized. She still has nightmares. She still struggles to trust. She still doesn't know if she'll ever be able to have normal relationships. The verdict didn't heal her. The legislation bearing her name didn't heal her. Nothing has healed her, and I'm not sure anything ever will." She paused, letting that difficult truth settle. What we can do is make sure that other families don't face what we faced, that other children don't wait 9 months for their first therapy appointment, that other parents don't have to choose between paying for treatment and paying for housing, that other children don't face a legal system that protects them in theory while traumatizing them in practice. The work became Jennifer's life. Sarah remained her primary concern, but advocating for change gave Jennifer purpose in the midst of her daughter's ongoing suffering. She was channeling her trauma into systemic reform, trying to ensure that the victory in her daughter's case actually translated into genuine support for families like hers. Doctor watched Sarah's progress with measured hope. The girl was functioning better than she had been. She was speaking more, though still selectively. She was having fewer violent episodes. She was developing, slowly, some capacity to trust, but healing from early childhood sexual abuse was, in doctors' professional assessment, a lifelong process. Sarah would likely always carry scars. But with proper support, with a mother who understood her trauma, with therapy and medication and time, she might build a life that, while different from what it could have been, held meaning and connection. "How is she really doing?" Jennifer asked during one of their parent consultations, using the code between them. How is Sarah really doing? Not the surface answer, but the deep truth. Doctor considered carefully. "She's stronger than she realizes," she said finally. "She's endured something that would devastate most people. She keeps getting up. She keeps trying. That's remarkable, even if it doesn't feel remarkable to her." Jennifer nodded, holding onto that assessment during the long nights when Sarah screamed, during the social isolation, during the financial struggle, during all of it. Her daughter was remarkable. She always had been. That had never changed, even when everything else had. Sarah Mitchell sat in the bleachers of high school on a gray October afternoon, her face obscured by the crowd of other teenagers. She was 13 years old now, no longer the silent 3-year-old who'd captured a nation's attention, no longer the brave 4-year-old who'd. She was simply a high school freshman, unremarkable in appearance, deliberately invisible. That was exactly how she wanted it. A decade had passed since her disclosure in doctor's office. A decade since the trial that changed everything. A decade of ongoing therapy, medication management, social struggle, and slow, incremental healing. Sarah had never given an interview about her case. She'd requested early on that her real name not be used in any continuing media coverage. The Nashville Children's Advocacy Foundation used her case as a reference point, a victim we work with, or a survivor from our early years, but always anonymously, always protecting the privacy of the girl who'd become a symbol without ever wanting to be one. Yet the legacy of her case was everywhere, even if most people didn't realize it. In the Office of Doctor, training materials featuring trauma-informed interview techniques bore implicit references to Sarah's case, though her name was never mentioned. The protocols he'd developed through working with her had become the gold standard taught to tens of thousands of professionals. His institute had trained investigators in 43 states. The methods that had allowed Sarah to finally speak with safety had become the standard approach to interviewing child victims nationwide. At law school, Professor Williams taught a seminar titled Child Witnesses and the Evolution of American Justice, which used Sarah's case as its central example. Students who'd never heard her name studied the legal principles that had been established through her trial. They learned about the intersection of constitutional rights and victim protection. They understood, in ways previous generations of lawyers hadn't, that protecting defendants' rights didn't require traumatizing child victims. In prosecutors' offices across the country, Robert's manual Believing Children, a guide to modern child abuse prosecution, sat on desks and in training rooms. Hundreds of convictions in child abuse cases had resulted from the prosecutorial strategies he'd pioneered while working Sarah's case. Predators who would have walked free under the old system were now serving sentences because the system had evolved. The conviction rate in child abuse cases had increased by an average of 42% nationwide. Thousands of children had been spared the secondary trauma of watching their abusers escape accountability. Judge Harold had retired 3 years earlier and was now a consultant on judicial reform. He'd authored a book titled Evolving Justice: How Courts Can Protect the Vulnerable While Ensuring Fair Trials, which had influenced judicial policy in multiple states. He'd never named Sarah Mitchell in his writings, but everyone in the legal community understood whose case had fundamentally changed his understanding of justice. At judicial conferences, judges who'd never met Sarah Mitchell heard her story, carefully anonymized but unmistakably present, as an example of why the system had to change. Journalist Torres, the prize winner whose investigation had catalyzed the national conversation, had continued his work on child protection issues. His book, Speaking Truth: How One Child's Voice Changed America's Justice System, remained in print, taught in journalism schools, and used in criminal justice courses. Torres had moved on to other investigations, other injustices, but he still occasionally reflected on Sarah's case in interviews. "That story changed my understanding of what journalism could do," he'd said in one interview. "It showed me that sometimes bearing witness to injustice and telling that story truthfully could actually lead to systemic reform. That's a powerful realization for a journalist." By the 10-year mark, the Sarah Mitchell Act existed in 38 states. Each state had adapted it to fit their legal systems, but the core principles remained consistent. Child witnesses now had protections they'd never had before. Conviction rates in child abuse cases had improved dramatically. More importantly, children who came forward with disclosures were met with trained professionals who understood trauma, who asked questions carefully, who supported rather than re-traumatized them. Doctor had become an internationally recognized expert on child trauma and interviewing. He'd been invited to speak in 15 countries. He'd consulted on cases in Canada, Australia, and the United Kingdom. His methods, refined through working with children like Sarah, had become the standard globally. In his office in Nashville, there was a single photograph, with Sarah's face deliberately obscured, showing the moment of her breakthrough in therapy. He showed it to every group of trainees he worked with, explaining that this was why their work mattered. "Every child deserves to be heard," he would say, pointing to the photograph. "Every child deserves to have their truth believed. Our job is to create systems and methods that make that possible." Jennifer Mitchell stood in the offices of the Nashville Children's Advocacy Foundation, reviewing reports from the previous fiscal year. The foundation had grown from a one-woman operation in her home to an organization with a staff of 12. They'd helped over 8,000 families in the past decade. They'd trained over 3,000 professionals. They'd distributed over $2 million in financial assistance to families devastated by child abuse. They'd before legislative committees in 7 states. They'd changed policies in multiple jurisdictions. But Jennifer's proudest work was the creation of the comprehensive victim support model, which she'd fought for in every state where the Sarah Mitchell Act had been implemented. The model included immediate crisis intervention and stabilization services for victims and non-offending family members, comprehensive mental health services lasting as long as necessary, not arbitrarily limited, financial assistance covering lost wages, therapy costs not covered by insurance, housing stability and transportation, dedicated victim advocates walking families through the legal process, school-based support services, peer support groups for survivors. 12 states had now implemented the full model. In those states, outcomes for child victims showed marked improvement. Families weren't bankrupted by pursuing justice. Children received appropriate therapeutic support. Healing was prioritized alongside prosecution. Sarah, sitting in the high school bleachers, knew nothing of these accomplishments, or rather, she knew them intellectually but had deliberately kept herself separated from them. She didn't want to be a symbol. She didn't want to be the girl whose case changed the system. She wanted to be a regular teenager as much as her trauma allowed. And in many ways she was. She attended school. She had 2 close friends, relationships built slowly and carefully over years. She participated in the school's photography club, finding in the camera a way to express things she couldn't articulate verbally. She was quiet, somewhat withdrawn, but increasingly capable of existing in social situations without overwhelming anxiety. But she still had nightmares. She still took medication. She still saw a doctor twice weekly. She still struggled with trust and intimacy. She likely always would. Healing from childhood sexual abuse, as Doctor had explained many times, was not about erasing the trauma. It was about learning to carry it, to build a life around it, to not let it completely define her. What Sarah didn't fully understand, what she might never fully understand, was that her suffering had not been meaningless. That by speaking, by being believed, by testifying despite her terror, she had set in motion a cascade of changes that had protected thousands of other children. That her case had become a teaching moment in law schools and police academies and prosecutor offices across the country. That her name, though not spoken publicly, had become synonymous with justice finally evolving to protect its most vulnerable citizens. 10 years after her disclosure, Sarah Mitchell was just a teenager at a high school football game, eating overpriced stadium popcorn and trying to remember the names of the players on the field. She was ordinary and unremarkable, exactly as she wanted to be. Yet her extraordinary courage a decade earlier had transformed how an entire nation understood justice, childhood, and truth. The girl who couldn't speak had ultimately spoken louder than anyone imagined, not because she'd sought attention or recognition, not because she'd wanted to be a symbol or a catalyst for change, but simply because she'd found the courage to tell the truth, and the world had finally learned to listen. That listening, that believing, that willingness to evolve the system, that was her legacy. Not a woman or a senator or a famous case. Just the quiet understanding that children's voices mattered, that trauma was real, that justice could be reformed to protect rather than further harm. As Sarah sat in the bleachers, anonymous among thousands of other teenagers, she didn't know that her case was being taught in law schools, that her story was changing how investigations were conducted, that her trial had set a precedent that countless children would benefit from. She just knew that she was surviving, that she was healing, slowly and incompletely, but genuinely, that she was building a life, different from what it could have been, but meaningful nonetheless. And somewhere in that survival, in that slow healing, in that quiet persistence, was a kind of victory. Not the dramatic victory of the courtroom verdict, but the deeper, more important victory of a child who'd been devastated by evil, who'd had her voice stolen, who'd before a nation watching, and who was now, 10 years later, simply and bravely living. The girl who had spoken had changed everything. But most importantly, she was changing herself. From victim to survivor, from symbol to person, from the child who couldn't speak to a teenager who was learning, finally, to speak on her own terms.